2,000 years after his death, Julius Caesar's greatest tactical moves still unsettle military strategists. Imagine commanding 60,000 men as enemy armies over 300,000 strong close in from both sides, with defeat spelling the end of your civilization. Yet at Alesia, Caesar reshaped the impossible. His double rings of fortifications spanned more than 25 miles and demanded over 60,000 trees felled in 6 weeks. No other general ever risked so much with so little. But how did he pull this off? And what hidden genius turned disaster into dominance at Sabis and Pharsalus? The secrets behind these legendary feats begin here. Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy, one of the foremost historians on Roman warfare, explains that the logistics behind Caesar's siege at Alesia are almost without parallel in ancient history. Archaeological surveys at Mont Ossois have confirmed the outlines of both the inner and outer rings of fortifications, matching Caesar's own descriptions remarkably closely. Using remote sensing and laser scanning, researchers have traced the remnants of trenches and ramparts stretching for miles across the Burgundian landscape. Physical proof that the double encirclement was not just a boast in Caesar's commentaries, but a feat realized through relentless labor and precision. Estimates suggest that over 60,000 trees were felled in just 6 weeks to provide the timber for palisades, towers, and defensive stakes. The legions worked in shifts, day and night, often under the threat of sudden attack from the besieged Gauls or the approaching relief army. Each segment of wall demanded careful adaptation to the terrain. Steep slopes reinforced with earthworks, low ground protected by water-filled ditches, and every approach layered with obstacles, rows of sharpened stakes, hidden pits, and iron hooks designed to break the momentum of any assault. Goldsworthy notes that the Romans didn't simply build a single continuous barrier. Instead, they integrated natural features, hills, rivers, ravines, so the lines of defense became a seamless part of the landscape. Where the ground was weakest, or the threat greatest, additional towers and redoubts rose every 80 feet, providing overlapping fields of missile fire. The archaeological record, from post holes to iron caltrops, matches the battle's scale. More than 30 kilometers of fortifications, constructed in record time by an army that understood both engineering and urgency. This was not just a wall, but a living system, designed to hold back 2 enemies at once. The ingenuity on display at Alesia set a new standard for field fortification and remains a subject of study for military engineers to this day. Roman legionaries set to work in teams, armed with picks, shovels, and axes, transforming the hills and valleys around Alesia into a fortress of their own making. The first task: dig a trench 20 feet wide and 9 feet deep, running the full length of each line. In low ground, these ditches filled with water from diverted streams, creating a moat that swallowed any who tried to cross. Piles of earth from the excavation formed a rampart behind the trench, crowned with a timber palisade that soared 23 feet into the air. Every 80 feet, a watchtower rose above the wall, each stocked with stones, javelins, and archers, giving the Romans overlapping fields of fire day and night. Beyond the main rampart, the ground bristled with hidden dangers. Legionaries hammered thick wooden stakes, called cipi, into the earth in staggered rows. Between these, they dug pits, each camouflaged with brush and fitted with sharpened stakes at the bottom. Iron hooks, known as stimuli, were scattered in the grass, ready to cripple men and horses alike. The work was relentless. Soldiers rotated in shifts, some felling trees in the forests, others shaping logs into palisades, while engineers measured and marked each segment for uniformity. The scale was staggering. Over 30 kilometers of fortifications, built in less than 6 weeks, with raw manpower and discipline as the only engines. What emerged was more than a barricade. The double wall became a weapon in itself, a layered defense that slowed, funneled, and broke any assault before it reached Roman steel. Every ditch, every hidden pit, every tower was designed not just to hold ground, but to bleed the enemy's strength before a single sword was drawn. The legionaries, from veteran centurions to the newest recruits, became builders and guardians of a living fortress, their labor turning the ODDS in Caesar's favor. On the final day at Alesia, the air crackled with urgency. As dawn broke, the Gallic relief army massed 60,000 warriors at a northwest gap in Caesar's outer wall, one of the few stretches where the fortifications remained incomplete. Under Vercissivilanus, they hurled fascines into the trenches, filling ditches with bundled brushwood and earth, then surged forward with ladders and shields raised. The earth shook as thousands pressed into the breach, scaling the rampart and clashing hand to hand with the Roman defenders above. At the same moment, inside the fortress, Vercingetorix's trapped garrison launched a desperate assault against the inner line, forcing the Romans to split their strength between two fronts. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Roman reserves rushed to reinforce the weak point, but the pressure mounted as Gallic warriors poured through the gap. Commanders shouted orders from the ramparts, and the clang of steel and the cries of the wounded echoed across the hills. Then, with the breach threatening to collapse, Caesar made his move. He ordered the release of his entire cavalry reserve, 13,000 horsemen, many of them fierce Germanic allies, who had waited on the flanks for this moment. Spurring their mounts, the cavalry swept around the hill, riding unseen behind the enemy's exposed rear. The charge crashed into the Gallic relief force, just as they reached the crest of the rampart. Panic rippled through the attackers as Roman cavalrymen hurled javelins and slashed at the unprotected backs of warriors already locked in combat. The Gallic column buckled, then broke, fleeing in chaos down the slope. Those trapped between the walls and the Roman lines were cut down or forced to surrender. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched as his last hope vanished. The next morning, he rode out in full armor and laid his sword at Caesar's feet, ending the siege and breaking the power of the Gallic tribes for good. Archaeologist Marta Rosa stands at the edge of the Sabas River's gravel bank, pointing out a subtle break in the tree line only 400 yards from where Caesar's legions camped. She explains that dense thorn hedges, deliberately left uncut by the Nervi, concealed the entire Gallic force. These natural barriers funneled the Romans into a narrow corridor, masking the true scale of the ambush. Soil analysis and pollen samples confirm centuries-old hedgerows, acting as a living wall that would have blocked both sight and sound until the very moment of attack. Leadership scholar Dr. Helen Pierce studies the psychological aftermath of such surprise assaults. She notes that the Roman column, trained for open battle, found itself trapped by terrain and vegetation, its lines fragmented, its command structure momentarily paralyzed. In modern terms, Pierce calls this a classic case of shock and disorientation. The sudden eruption of tens of thousands of Nervi from the woods triggered a contagious panic, as soldiers saw their comrades break and heard the enemy's war cries closing in. She draws on transformational leadership theory to explain Caesar's response. When a commander exposes himself to the same mortal risk as his troops, it can reset the emotional temperature of an entire unit. Naming centurions in the chaos, rallying the 10th Legion by name, these were not just tactics, but acts of psychological triage, restoring focus and cohesion where structure had collapsed. Rosa and Pierce agree. The terrain at Sabas did more than shape the ambush. It forced Caesar to improvise, turning the battle from a test of discipline into a crucible of leadership and morale. Signal horns stayed silent. The only warning was a sudden roar as the Nervii broke from the tree line, tens of thousands sprinting across the gravel bank with shields raised and spears ready. In the Roman camp, the world spun out of order. Legionaries had just begun stacking shields and removing armor, their lines scattered along the riverbank and hillside. Before orders could be shouted, the first Nervii reached the Roman outposts, hurling javelins and smashing into men still fumbling for weapons. The shock was total. Centurions tried to rally their cohorts, but many fell in the first moments, cut down as they shouted commands. The Roman left and center collapsed into confusion, with some cohorts surrounded before they could form up. Packs of Nervi surged between tents and baggage carts, hacking at isolated groups as the Roman line broke apart. Soldiers tripped over tent ropes and stumbled through thorny brush, desperate to find their standards or commanders. In the chaos, shields were grabbed from the nearest pile, sometimes not even their own. The air filled with the sound of clashing iron, screams, and the pounding of thousands of feet. Within minutes, the disciplined order of the Roman march dissolved into a desperate struggle for survival. In the heart of the chaos, clusters of legionaries locked shields instinctively, forming knots of resistance. But the Nervi pressed in from every side, exploiting every gap. For many, there was no time to look for their officers, only to fight or be swept away in the surge. Caesar, thrust into the heart of chaos, seized a shield from a fallen soldier and pushed forward through the press of panicked men. His voice cut through the noise, calling the 10th Legion by name, urging them to stand their ground. Veterans who had marched with him from Gaul to Britain locked eyes with their general and closed ranks, forming a defensive square, shields overlapping, spears bristling outward. The Nervi surged in waves, but the square held, a living wall in the river's gravel. In that first minute, the tide began to turn. Legionaries who had stumbled in confusion now found purpose at the center of the formation, rallying to the eagle standard. On the right, Labienus, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, signaled the 12th Legion to join the square. With a shout, they linked shields and pressed in, reinforcing the battered line. At Caesar's order, Roman cavalry, which had regrouped behind the camp, wheeled around and struck the mass of Nervi from behind. The timing was precise. While the legions held the front, horsemen drove deep into the enemy's exposed rear. Trapped between the square and the cavalry, the Nervi's formation collapsed. For 3 hours, the battle raged across the bank and hillside. By the end, nearly 60,000 Nervi warriors lay dead, including almost every elder and chieftain. Roman losses were staggering, over 7,000, many from the first chaotic moments. But the army had survived what should have been total destruction. Caesar's shield grab and the desperate stand of the 10th Legion had transformed disaster into victory, restoring Roman control and forever sealing the loyalty of his men. Colonel John Allen, a career officer and military historian, stands over a map of Alesia, tracing the double lines of fortification with a practiced hand. He explains that what set Caesar apart wasn't just engineering skill or brute force, but a deep understanding of reserve doctrine, a principle still drilled into modern armies. In Allen's view, the heart of Alesia's defense was not the walls themselves, but the way Caesar managed his manpower behind them. The concept is simple, but powerful. Hold back a portion of your best troops, ready to intervene at the decisive moment, rather than committing everything at once. This is what modern tacticians call a burst reserve, a force kept fresh and flexible, able to plug gaps or launch a counterstrike when the enemy's main effort reveals itself. Allen points out that Caesar's operational maps, reconstructed from archaeological surveys and ancient texts, show clear patterns. Reserves stationed at redoubts near likely attack points, cavalry positioned on the flanks, but never fully committed until the crisis. The Romans rotated units through the towers and ramparts, ensuring that no sector was left exhausted or exposed for long. When the Gallic relief army massed at the northwest gap, Caesar's ability to instantly shift his reserves, especially his cavalry, became the fulcrum of the entire battle. Allen notes that this doctrine, born on the hills of Burgundy, echoes through centuries of military theory. Never show all your strength until the enemy has shown theirs, and always keep something back for the moment that matters most. Caesar selected 3,000 of his most disciplined legionaries and quietly withdrew them from the main line before dawn. These men, all veterans handpicked for their nerves and precision, assembled in silence behind the right wing, where the Roman cavalry, outnumbered 7-1, waited for the opening clash. Scouts had returned with reports of Pompey's cavalry massing on the far left, confirming what Caesar suspected. The enemy would strike hardest here, aiming to sweep around and break the Roman flank. Instead of reinforcing with more horsemen, Caesar prepared something entirely different. He ordered the reserve cohorts to conceal their presence, kneeling behind a low rise and using the dust and confusion of the cavalry to remain unseen. Centurions moved through the ranks, passing along a new command. When the moment came, the fourth line would not throw their pila in the usual volley. Instead, they were to grip the heavy javelins by the midshaft and thrust upward, targeting the faces and eyes of enemy riders. This was no ordinary drill. The pilum, normally a missile, would become a spear for close combat, a weapon designed to unnerve horses and terrify cavalrymen who expected only scattered resistance. The order spread in whispers: hold fast, wait for the signal, strike for the face. The reserve stood ready, every muscle tensed, as the sun climbed and the distant thunder of hooves grew louder across the open plain. Pompey's cavalry thundered forward, certain of victory as they swept aside Caesar's outnumbered horsemen. But as they surged past the Roman right, a new threat burst from the dust. 3,000 of Caesar's finest legionaries rose from concealment, shields locked and pila gripped not for throwing, but for close combat. The order was simple and brutal: aim for the face. As Pompey's cavalry wheeled to exploit the gap, they met a wall of iron and upward thrusting spears. Horses reared and bucked as riders, unprotected by their armor, took javelins to the head and eyes. The shock was instant. Panic spread through the ranks, and the charge dissolved into chaos. Veterans who had never broken in battle turned and fled, trampling their own men in a desperate rush to escape. In moments, the entire left wing of Pompey's cavalry collapsed, scattering across the plain. Caesar seized the moment. He ordered the hidden fourth line to pivot, driving into the exposed flank of Pompey's infantry. The 10th Legion pressed forward in the center, cutting through wavering lines. The rout became unstoppable. By sunset, 15,000 of Pompey's men lay dead or captured, while Caesar's losses barely reached 1,000. A single, perfectly timed reserve had turned the tide, transforming certain defeat into overwhelming victory. Modern military academies still dissect Caesar's maneuvers, not for nostalgia, but because unpredictability and adaptation remain the edge in any conflict. In an age of drones and algorithms, the power of decisive leadership and calculated risk still shapes victory or defeat. The ancient battlefield isn't gone, it's only changed form. Which tactic would you trust your fate to today? Share your thoughts below.